Good day, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this special webinar. Today's session is Project Management Essentials for CAMs and board members, proudly presented by Overton Construction and Consulting in collaboration with AKAM Management.
We're delighted to have Paul Overton, Principal of Overton Construction and Consulting, leading today's presentation. Paul brings extensive experience in guiding boards and managers through complex projects with confidence and clarity.
Andre joining us as our special guest is Maureen Reyes, Vice President of Business Development from AKAM Management, who will be adding her insights and expertise to the discussion.
We have a lot of valuable content to share, so let's get started.
My name is Paul Overton. I'm the owner and CEO of Overton Construction and Consulting. The type of work that we specialize in is we are general contractors. We do exterior facade renovations related to 558 claims and Senate Bill 4D, HB 913, SB 154. We do structural integrity reserve studies, milestone inspections, and we also we do a lot of owners representation. So if you need those services, Maria's stuff's all in the chat room, and you let us know. So very excited about this presentation. Maureen reached out to me and said, "Hey, I want to do a specific topic for my board members and CAMs." And so we were able to put together the PowerPoint, submit it to the DBPR, and now we have this CPRAID approved. So without further ado, let's get started. So an introduction. This presentation will equip community association managers and board members with the essential knowledge and strategies for successful construction project management. So we understand that, you're going to have a general contractor, you're going to have a manager, you likely will have an owner's rep, there'll be an engineer, but we want to give you some essential tools as managers and board members. So, you're going to be looking at all this from 30,000 feet. I'm going to give you some tools to spot check, make sure the team is working together, some strategies, what to look for, and hopefully some cost saving initiatives that you can implement or at least think about. Okay, let's do an overview of today's objectives. Critical components. We want to understand the critical components involved in construction project and, planning, contracting, scheduling, oversight. We want to equip CAMs and board members with best practice to manage the projects efficiently and effectively. And we want to enhance project outcomes by emphasizing the importance of planning, proactive management, oversight throughout every stage.
I know you had a presentation. Maria, are you able to share it? Because it's beautiful, the presentation that you have put together.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, you got.
I thought this would be okay. So you're gonna have to make me the host, I think, real quick.
Done.
All right.
Because sometimes I know with technology, it's like different screens, and there we go.
Good call. Good call. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, and Paul, one of the things, when you registered, if you didn't put your license, which is okay, we're going to be sending out a communication between Maria and my team. So we'll get your license. This is towards your CEU, okay? So it's an important course, just not of learning, but also it gives you credits as part.
Yeah, and I had one of your managers reach out to me yesterday, and they wanted they could get a certificate of completion, and we actually have one for this course. So, it's for the board members. She has a specific project or community that our board members were going to attend here today. And so, yes, if you want a certificate of completion, please also let us know, and we'll get one for you. Okay, construction projects maintain and improve the property value. It ensures buildings meet current codes and standards. Well-maintained facilities improve resident experience and reduce complaints. Proactive maintenance, helps lower future costs. There's a lot of projects out there that have come about because of deferred maintenance. And proper plan reduces disputes, delays, and insurance issues. And especially, when it comes to the SB4D stuff, we have these certain mandates and we have these timelines and everybody's, trying to comply. So, starting early, planning early is kind of going to be the theme here. And also putting together your team with the help of your management company and the other people that you rely on for as your experts. Okay, we have some issues that come along with construction projects, especially big ones. We sometimes we see budget overruns, delays, potential legal disputes, and I would say during the course of any project, its life cycle, you're going to be faced with change orders, and we'll get into that more in a little bit too. But I don't think people should look at change order like they're an evil thing because typically it's really hard for an engineer or a professional like me to scope out repairs that are hidden in the concrete. Like we do our best, but we can't see through concrete. We can't see through stucco, and potentially, there's the scope could broaden, and might be additional rebar repairs or square footage of concrete. So, I caution a caution to board members and managers. It's kind of a necessary evil. What you got to be careful for is to make sure that you're not getting overcharged, that you have some planning effect that has some sort of unit costing, and you've worked that out beforehand.
Yeah, and I think Paul, you mentioned the key is understanding your scope and clearly what defines the unit. Because when there's always going to be a work order change, there's always you're trying to minimize it as best as possible. But again, key takeaways is understanding the unit price, because when this happens and you will have it, you'll learn that earlier in the stage, not when you're already in it. I think those are key, and I know you're going to anticipate that chit chat right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Maureen and I see, well, our whole team, we see a lot of projects where we're brought in and the manager's like, okay, I have a scope of work. We have an engineer, we have specifications and drawings. And I said, great. I thought that's good job. But then they send them to me and it's not complete. So in other words, they may have a special protocol to repair a full depth concrete repair spot. Say it's whatever, 3x3, and a process to, remove the rebar and put your rebar in there and coat it. They may have that process, but there's no quantities on the scope of work. So my first question is, okay, well, this is great, but we can't bid, or you can't get competitive bids until this is complete. And they're like, well, that's all they gave us. So I want you to be very wary and cautious about if you're getting something from, it could be somebody like me, it could be, owner's rep, could be engineer, could be architect. Make sure that they quantify the repairs, because if they don't, and you think that's what you're getting, make sure to ask that question up front. Are you going to give me quantities? Because if they say no, you may want to look for another engineer, because you can't go anywhere unless you have quantities. And also, in terms of your contract, you really want to stipulate certain quantities. If you go over that, then you get into the change order conversation. But there's also a possibility you go under that. So making sure that you quantify the repairs is really, really important. Proactive involvement of boards and CAMs is key to driving efficiency. Hopefully somewhere in the process you get an owner's rep and you're getting weekly updates and meetings and you're keeping up with the schedule. Some boards and managers are more hands off and some want to be involved. We let them tell us to what extent, but you need some involvement. The key really is to hire a good team of professionals, and like I know Maureen can direct you to the right people. For me, usually the team is made up of an engineer, You have to have an engineer of record. You have to have a general contractor, and then under him, you have your subcontractors. And then typically you're going to have an owner's representative. Um, and we're going to get more into the owner's rep, but the use of owner's reps has skyrocketed in South Florida, and for good reason. The jobs are big, they're complicated. And at the end of the day, managers and board members, they're not construction experts. They've been around it. They know a lot of stuff. But in terms of looking at change orders or approving payoffs or all these sort of things, it's a very, very large administrative burden. And if you're trying to manage, a 40-story high rise and then trying to do all this other stuff, you're probably going to want some help.
Yeah. Something's going to fail also. And you want to, like you said, you want to put the winning team in there with the professionals that really have the exposure of not just doing one project or two in their career, but multiple multi-million-dollar projects. I think that's what is important to mention, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit about payment and performance bonds and bid bonds. We're going to kind of gloss over that, but really the conversation should be about payment performance bonds. And, I've worked all across the United States. I've been in Portland, Oregon, 7 markets in California, Phoenix, Vegas, Colorado, Dallas, Houston, Austin. I've been everywhere for my previous company. And I've literally been involved in thousands of deals and construction projects. And really, South Florida is the only place in the United States that I've worked that requires a payment performance bond on every single project. Now, I would never say it's not a safety net. But on the other hand, I've never seen a claim against the payment or performance bond. So you really have to weigh, a lot of times contractors, it costs money. It's going to cost the HOA money. It could be 1%, 2%, 3% of contract value. So you have to weigh the costs against, the risks. And I just really, what I want to convey is if you're really short on money, I'm not saying you take the money out of the payment performance bond, but I'm also saying that there's options. Okay. Typically in other parts of the United States, we use retainage. We do regular inspections to make sure the work meets code, get the city inspectors out there, get the engineers out there, get the owner's rep out there, and make sure the repairs are right. And then typically what we do is we only allow, if I'm an owner's rep, I'm only going to allow the contractor to bill for completed work, right? And then we verify that. So if you're only paying for work completed and you verified that the repairs are correct, then and you get a lien release from the prime contractor and the subcontractor, you're in a good position where likely you're not going to need a payment performance bond. But again, those are conversations with your general counsel, attorney, and your manager. And I'm not a lawyer, but that's just what I've seen. So you have a couple ways to go.
No, and Paul, so the most important, I'm talking about lawyers, and I just want to add an emphasis here, right? We, when you're looking at these capital projects, right? We're not talking about $1,000. We're talking about, millions and millions of dollars of an investment that the stakeholders are relying on the board to make the proper decisions. You have to involve your attorney, and more importantly, a construction attorney too. Okay, because that's important. You can have the general counsel who deals with the day-to-day operations like your manager, right? But you also have attorneys that are expert on reading these contractual contracts, basically the construction contracts, that can make sure all of this protects the association. Okay, and I think that's important to mention, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I guess one more thing on payment performance funds. So if we use the example of the $20 million job, pay a performance bond could be $600,000. So again, you got to weigh risk, the cost, what could I give for title money, where could I use that money, or are there alternative methods that we don't have to use a pay no warrants bond? So again, like Maureen said, those are all conversations. Probably once you put your team together or you're working on contract negotiations with your construction attorney, he can help you figure all that out. I can say from experience in getting bids as a general contractor and an owner's rep that this is one of the reasons prices are going up, because a lot of contractors can't get payment performance bond or they've reached their ceiling. Okay. So you may get, let's say a small contractor can get a $3 million bond with a $5 million aggregate. That means they can have one job worth $3 million. They can have several jobs not to exceed $5 million. Once they hit that ceiling, they can't get no more bonding. So you've actually eliminated all of those other contractors that have reached their limit, and now you're left with just a handful of contractors who, who knows? I've seen prices go up just because they know other people can't get bonds. So be careful. Word of caution, that's all. Okay, some of the most important project manuals include creating a project plan, managing project risks, tracking the project phases, and communicating with the project stakeholders. Okay, we're going to talk about creating the RFP manual, one of my favorite topics. And, I've done, I don't know, maybe it's not 1,000, but I've done hundreds of these over the years. And, again, when I create an RFP manual, I want to have the subcontractor bid sheets in there. I want to have things like the property address, and I want to have a job block schedule. I want to have the drawings and specifications from the engineer. I want to have a whole package put together that I can send to the subcontractors for bids that includes everything. And also one of our goals with RFP, and I'm sure Maureen can attest to this, is we want apples to apples bids. And again, if the engineer, maybe through no fault of his own, or that wasn't part of his scope, doesn't quantify things, that's another reason to quantify things. Because if you ask 5 contractors to go bid concrete repairs, they're all going to come back with a different number, different quantities, different prices. So it's very important, at least for the bidding process, to quantify it. And if you have a 60-story building and you can't quantify everything without booms and swing stages and this sort of stuff, then you need to get on balconies and you need to get as close as you possibly can. But again, can't stress the importance of quantifying things. I've seen scopes of work like, we think there's 22,000 square feet of concrete repairs. Well, if I'm a board member or I'm a manager and somebody tells me that, I'm going to say, well, how do we know for sure? Because it could be 22,000, it could be 42,000. We only have a certain amount of budget. We only took out a loan for this amount. How do we quantify this and make sure that we don't have a budget overrun? Okay, create project boundaries, interview stakeholders, create scoring criteria. So for me, create scoring criteria means once we have the RFP created and we have all of the terms and conditions and we ask for their references and, we have the scope of work, we have the bid sheets, we have the quantities, we've reached out to contractors we know that does this type of work. And, maybe this is our specialty. And really, too, some of these people could be general contractors as well, right? You may have a general contractor subbing to a general contractor. This may be just a smaller contractor. You also may have, multiple different subcontractors. Maybe one's working on concrete restoration, one's working on waterproofing, and one's working on, balcony rails. So one of the ways that I like, at least as an owner's rep, that I like to try to save my clients money is, many times if a general contractor is or sub-people, if they're involved in a bidding process, they will go straight to the general contractors, the big ones that do this type of work, that will do everything, right? They just get a bid sheet. There's waterproofing, there's concrete repair, there's rebar repair, there's shoring, there's all these things, pavers, pool tiles, post-tension cables. It's really easy just to call a general contractor that does all this stuff and get a price from them. Well, remember, nothing against GCs, because I'm a GC too and they got to make money, but you're paying a premium because you're paying for all the subcontractors and the the margin and the overhead and markup for the GC. So depending on the dynamics in your project, if you have an owner's rep, you may be able to go to a separate, smaller and less expensive waterproofer. You may go to a smaller, less expensive painter. You may, that sort of thing. So keep in mind, that's kind of my scoring criteria. And then once we have all the bids back, what you do is typically we put together a bid matrix that compares everything apples to apples. And, at that point, you can kind of zero in on some pricing. I know a lot of times people throw out the low bid, that maybe there's some red flags there, and maybe the high bid and kind of work with the ones in the middle. But, those are all conversations with your attorney, your owner's rep, and likely the engineer and manager. Do you want to say something, Maureen?
Yeah, it's so clear, Paul, again, and I want to continue to put the emphasis. This is the reason why you have an owner's rep. This is the reason why you have an engineer doing this. Management's role is to put the winning team in front and obviously provide a clear communication to the membership. But we should not be doing, look at all the items that you have to put together to do a 1 million or 10 million or 20 million bid. There's no way a manager, even though you may be experienced enough, this is for, again, having those owners rep available to the membership, the engineer, etc. Because if not, you don't have a clear scope of work, you'll just need to start all over again. And those are the pitfalls.
Yeah, it'd probably get really expensive too, off with everything in order. You get in a job with a scope that's kind of vague. Nobody really knows what they're doing. It opens you up to all kinds of change orders, scope changes. But you hear the horror stories all the time. We had a $5,000 concrete restoration job. Now we're at 40 million. And for me, I look like that's impossible. Like, that's total incompetence on somebody's part, because how could you even allow that to happen? And I would bet that most of it has to do with the original scope of work and the RFPs and putting the right team in place. Because, you put a bunch of professionals together, you're not going to have an overrun of $35 million. It's just,
Right.
I guess maybe there's some outlier there that I'm in a situation I've never seen, but that just tells me a lack of planning, and a bad scope of work. Okay, let's talk a little bit about construction contracts.
Well, before you continue, we have a few questions. I don't know if you want to answer them as we go, or do you want to address them at the end?
Yeah, it's fine. Let's do a couple of questions.
Okay, so somebody asked, what do you think of an arrangement where the engineer gets 10% of the contractor's cost? What would you recommend?
Who gets 10% of the cost?
The engineer.
The engineer. Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but typically engineers' costs run anywhere. When I do like an expert bid analysis for a claim, I usually put in a placeholder of anywhere from 10 to 18% for engineering fees. So if they're not in that range, I think that's what you should plan on. If you want to agree to a 10% in the contract fee, I guess I would be okay with that. But, you could win, you could lose. It just depends on the extent of the contract and what they're doing. If it's a painting contract, you're not going to need an engineer. You will have to pay 10%. If you're into some full depth concrete repairs, the rebar and that sort of thing, it might be great. I'm never a big fan of just a blanket price. I always want to know the details. Even if it costs more, I want to know why. So I don't know, but I think they're in the range.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the next question we have is, what is the difference between an owner's rep and a project manager?
I get that a lot. So typically as a GC, if I'm in a GC role, I'm going to have a project manager. If it's a big job, he's going to be a dedicated project manager, meaning he goes there every day, all day long, and he manages the job for the GC. And typically, if the job's big enough, we may have like an assistant project manager or a technician. We may have other personnel on site to help manage that job. Just depends on, how big it is, how complicated it is. We need to make sure that we're managing the job for the GC, reporting to the GC, project manager's not recording to the owner's rep, they probably will because the owner's rep will ask them to, but their main role is to report back to the general contractor and be profitable. Okay. But there is a role that sometimes is confused as an owner's rep role. I will put a project manager there sometimes because I don't have time to be on every job all across Florida, and neither does anybody else that has these owners rep companies. So typically what happens is I say, look, I'm going to be involved, 10 hours a week or 8 hours a week, whatever it is. And then we're going to have this person as our project manager. He's going to be on site most of the time, or it's part-time, whatever. So he's called a project manager as well. So that's why it's a good question. It could be two different things.
And also it's important, again, going into contract, sorry, it's just the details, so much details. Also important when the association is engaging with an owner's rep, there's going to be a contract in between, which the association's legal counsel needs to look at, which defines the scope of work of the owner's rep. So it's going to define all the projects that they're going to oversee, how many hours are they going to have allocated to the association. And again, the meetings that they're going to have to the stakeholders, if they're, going to include once a month. I have in many associations that I help oversee and support. They go once a month, they do a town hall, not a board meeting, a town hall. So it goes directly, and they just let the membership know where they are in the projects, what permitting stage, etc. So again, there's going to be a contract in between the association and the owner's rep with a clear defined scope of work of what the owner's rep needs to do. The owner's rep, like Paul says, typically will have a project manager who will be the face, who will be in front of the membership. But again, you have to define the contract with the association legal counsel.
Yeah, great point. Great point. And just by getting under contract, you want the owner's rep to define exactly what they're going to do. Like, if we're going to write a contract, we're going to list this person will be on this job this many hours a week. The project manager will be on this many hours per week. Add it up for a monthly total, and typically we'll give a not to exceed. The not to exceed is based on what we're projecting in our conversations with the board. But if they want us to do other duties that we didn't originally anticipate, then we'll have some sort of hourly rate for all the different people, and each person will have their own hourly rate. So lump sum contractors are the most popular. It's just basically it's a bid to do all the work. It's a fixed price, and if the scope changes, price goes up. It's a scope. It goes down, it can go down. Just make sure that you have that in your contract. Those are the most popular to me, I guess, to board members and managers. They probably seem the most safe because now they have something that they can bank on. Unit price is another type of contract, which doesn't work unless you have everything quantified scientifically, like right down to the square foot. And if the scope broadens, or there's more scope added, or there's additional repairs, of course the unit cost is going to go up. For me, this is a little bit more risky. And then you get into these arguments about, okay, well, the rebar result, there's only 1 foot of rebar that needed to be replaced, but you made an opening 2 feet wide. And so we only pay for the 1 foot. No, we got to pay for 2 because we need the room to get around. It's just, it becomes very convoluted. Fixed price is way better. Cost plus, I'm not opposed to cost plus. That builds in as long as you have a quantified scope of work. Cost plus is basically I'm giving you a price to do the job essentially at cost. I'm showing you my subcontractor's contracts with me. He's $100,000 for waterproofing 100 balconies. And then I get 15% or 10% or 8% or whatever it is, the arrangement we work out. And I think this is a real workable solution. The board, typically the fixed price contract, you're not going to know what the general contractor's overhead is. So, this is maybe a little bit more transparent. and it's for this general contractor, it's probably a little safer because, he knows that he's just going to show his bids to the board, the manager, the owner's rep, and he's going to get 15% on top of that. That's what actually a really good situation for the GC. There's very little risk. But again, I think lump sum would probably trump that one, just for transparency. And time and materials. So this is a way that most boards, managers, and owners rep are not going to want. There may be terminology in your contract about time and materials, but usually what that applies to is a fixed sum contract. And if there's additional scope, or there's like hurricane preparedness type plans, or there's things of this nature that could potentially happen, what we do is we ask them for a time and material price. Okay, what is it for labor, and what is your materials plus markup cost, and put that in the bid sheets. So, say the hurricane's hitting next week, we got to take down all the scaffolding, we have to store it, we put sandbags up, we have to cover roofs, big elevations of direct applied stucco. Then you know how much it's going to cost. And it's really hard to predict the weather, especially in South Florida. So I feel like there's always going to be some sort of time and materials along with the fixed lump sum. But I would discourage probably a time and materials contract unless you knew the contract was really, really well and it was probably a smaller job.
Yeah, no, and Paul, I think that you hit it clearly. It's always important to know the financial impact, and to put in the contract of, again, hurricanes, emergency whatnot, because the association needs to know to allocate. We cannot predict, but at least you have it in your contract and you understand financially how it will impact you.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a slide for this, but I think every contract should have some kind of hurricane preparedness or storm preparedness.
Yep. Yeah, the mobilization is crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into a little bit about the owner's rep. The owner's rep is, I would say, it's became very popular in the last 10 years. Having exposure all across the United States, that I've never seen where they specifically called them an owner's representative. Like, you would have these Crestfield general contractors that were retired, and they take on kind of a construction management role, oversee the job. Some are good, some not so much. But, again, the complexity of the jobs in South Florida and the size of them and the amount of them, and, I've heard other reasons why maybe things aren't up and up on some jobs. We hear all the horror stories. Boards are getting fined, they're getting sued, contractors, a lot of litigation. So I think it's warranted. They play a very important role, and I think it depends on too how you leverage your owner's rep, right? You can have your owner's rep just come in and do weekly checkups and just inspect some work. Or, if it's a bigger job, you can actually have your owner's rep manage the job for you, get the contractor bids for you, define the scope of work for you, help you with contractor interviews, create the bid matrices, approve the payouts, give their opinions on change orders, whether you should approve them or not. These are all roles for the owner's rep. And remember, the owner's rep is looking out for the board's best interests. And for me, at the end of the day, for me, I like the owner's rep role because I've been a GC for so long now. And, it doesn't matter how good you are as a GC. There's always this kind of suspicion on the manager or board's part. Are they really charging what they should? They're probably making too much money. There's always this, it's not an adverse relationship, but it's maybe a little suspicious. As an owner's rep, I don't have that, right? I'm working for the board. I'm working for the manager coming. It's my job to look for ways to value engineer, to save money, to use material substitutions, to make sure that we're paying the right amount of money, to the inspection for getting signed off. Is it a recertification through Miami-Dade? What hoops do we got to jump through? Do we need specialized engineers? Do we need, all these sort of things the owner's rep can handle? And I think, nowadays, especially down here in this climate, this environment, I think it's almost really a necessity for owner's rep. And I kind of like to look at it like, I really can't speak on what other people charge, but I would like to think that, the fee that you pay for an owner's rep will probably be made up somehow in some sort of value engineering, or your project getting sideways, or, any number of things, scope creep, price creep, budget creep. I think, an owner's rep can come in there and try to mitigate that cost and almost, what they pay for his fee. So I think it's a win-win for the board, the manager, and the owner's rep. I like it, and I think management companies and the boards really need it. They need somebody looking out for that.
No, exactly, Pa. And again, remember, these are homes, live buildings. So again, we want to make sure that communication is always flowing to the stakeholders, to the owners, to the tenants, because even if it's your investment property, you have a tenant, it is going to be effective, the noise. So when you have all the owners rep, constantly communicating with the membership, constantly doing these town halls, giving a very transparent approach, it just helps overall the project. Again, I'm pretty sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, a new construction, I doubt that you have an owner's rep looking at a new construction and no one's living there, right? Maybe I'm, but
That's why they keep this.
right. But what I'm saying is, in these beautiful condominiums that, are 30, 40, 50, 60, absolutely, it's a great investment that the association would need to have, because that way the owner rep puts everyone on point, and basically, and make sure everything, is followed through based on the contracts, when to release the payments, etc.
Yeah. All right, let's skip ahead. Engineer records role. So you're going to need an engineer, and ideally the engineer is going to create the drawings and specifications right off the bat. He's going to be kind of the starting point. So not necessarily the starting point of who you hire. I mean, you're typically going to have your construction lawyer in place. And then for me, you should have your owner's rep in place too, because then he can advise and he can work with the engineer to help with the drawing specifications, the qualifications, the scope of work, and really have the board's best interest as these things are being created and before they go out to bid. So, a lot of the engineers also do owner's rep work. It's kind of hand in hand. They create the drawings and specifications. They can do inspections. So a lot of them are starting to do owner's rep work. But for me, if you hire a separate owner's rep, their job is to make sure they create the proper drawings and specifications, that they give you, the plan set so that you can pull permits and, inspect the repairs, likely inspect the repairs that they have scoped out once the contractor is done. And so typically what I like to see on inspections is have the owner's rep, the general contractor, and the engineer all together, to look at this work. And then, the owner's rep can act on the board's behalf, but that would be another role doing the inspections. And then, they do calculations and safety checks. Does this balcony need to be shored up? Are we chipping away too much in these shoring? Is there emergency shoring needed? Safety considerations. They have calculations. Can we put the swing stage tiebacks into this wall, this parapet wall? Do we need to install anchors? That sort of thing. So you're going to need an engineer, and you're going to need a good one, and he's going to play a very important role in your project. General contractor's role. I think a lot of us probably already know what the role of the GC is. Once the plans and specifications have been drawn up and either the engineer or owner's rep creates an RFP, we get all the bids back. And typically these bids are going to come from what I've seen, my experience, the bids are going to come back and they're going to be from general contractors who, either perform in-house work or they sub it out. And so their role really is to bid the project as you have designed it with the specifications, the drawings, and the quantities, and then they bid that work. And again, usually, a lot of the big GC companies, they have to at least, I know a lot of board members who came to me and said, look, we want somebody that self-performs, but here's the reality, especially in South Florida. If you're a big GC and you're doing these 5, 10, 15, $20 million reconstruction or concrete restoration jobs, like the likelihood of you having the personnel in-house to do this job without asking to hire a subcontract is very small. I know some people say these are our guys, do your due diligence. We sub out because it's impossible. I ran an in-house model for years and years and years and years and years, and I never liked it. There's not enough people in South Florida to hire. There's just, people are not going to these IT schools, or they're going into IT or rather work fast food or something. It's just not the artisans we used to have around. The labor prices are getting really high. You have the burden of the workman's comp. You have all these things that you try to self-perform. And how are you going to keep 30 stucco guys, 30 concrete restoration guys, 30 waterproofers, 30 framers, 30 window guys, 30, balcony rail install? It's just, you think about it in that perspective, it's almost impossible for somebody to sub out, not have to sub out at least some of it. And I know there's companies that have their own, we have our own concrete guys, which is great. But typically their role is to supply the bids, provide the labor, provide the materials, and allow the work to be done to make sure it meets code, and that the engineer and the owner's rep do the inspections. Especially contractors, I touched on this a little bit. Depending on the size of the project and your owner's rep, if I look at a job and say, okay, I got waterproofing, I got concrete restoration, I got a few PT cables, and some roof repairs, and I may have a conversation with the board and say, look, in this case, I don't think you need a GC. Like, we can certainly handle going and find you a waterproofer, going and find you a roofer to make repairs, going to find you a guy that does PT cables, and skip all the GC overhead. GCs right now in South Florida, I actually went to somebody else's presentation and the question came up, how much do you mark up labor materials? And they said between 25 and 35 points. It's a lot of money you could save. You're talking 1/3 of the project. So again, perfect opportunity to hire his owner's rep, and the fee that you paid him will, if you decide to go specialty contractors, could be more than made up. So keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. Good advice, Paul.
Okay, construction schedules and phasing. We're going to always ask for a construction schedule before we start the job. Usually, I see some people asking for the construction schedule while they're bidding it. That's tough. As a GC, people have asked me that, and I'm like, I don't know. We just gave me some numbers to bid off of. I don't know anything about sequencing, access. I don't know any of these things yet. So typically, when you get into contractor interviews and you start bidding them, then you start talking about construction schedule. When can you start? What does that look like for the association? How big is your workforce? How long do you think it'll take to complete this job? And then you get all this information together, and then you come up with some basic parameters, and you fill out like either a Gantt or a critical path construction schedule. And that's your starting point. It's going to be weather, which is very unpredictable. You have material deliveries. You have, labor issues. There's all kinds of variables that can affect the schedule. But what you want is a schedule to start with that makes sense, and you do your due diligence. And then what we like to do is just meet with the board and update it every couple of weeks. Like, what's changed? We're here now. We're supposed to be there. We're not. What is the next month look like, and then we'll have another update in 2 weeks. So very important. Yeah, go ahead.
And Paul, I'm sorry. Again, what's important as well is that, again, we're looking at permitting. We're looking at, different entities that the whole project, you have to work with. But what I think it's important here, as I always say, you got to inform the membership. If it's, and be honest. I mean, you have to be honest and say, listen, this project is not 6 months. This project's 18 months minimum. Right? Or this project, and again, as you mentioned, if there's any changes in the next 30 days, inform the membership. Let them know. So I want to bring that value as well, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We went to a job the other day, and we were being interviewed as an owner's rep, and I said, what is the size of the job? And they're like, well, it was 20 million, now it's 28 million. And I said, okay, how long do you project this job will take from board member standpoint? And he's like, 1 year. I'm like, it's just not realistic, because basically somebody told him, well, it could take a year, and now you only have to pay the owner's representative for the year. You'll be done. And it's just like, we really need to take a step back, and we need to create a schedule and some realistic and achievable timelines, put a schedule together, and then, it's nothing worse than starting a job and not know. You can't get to where you're going unless you have a map, and your map is your construction schedule.
Correct.
Change orders, our favorite topic. Like Maureen and I already touched on, listen, if you're doing a completed job, you should never have a change order unless you increase the square footage of paint or there's an issue with coverage. And usually that should be outlined in your construction contracts. If you pick a crazy color that doesn't cover in 1 or 2 coats, it's more money. If you add more painting square footage, it's more money. But typically, other than that, been paying buildings for 25 years. I don't think I've ever issued a change order just because there wasn't a scope change. Now, construction is different. You look at, let's say we have a 40-story project, and you hire a really good engineer, and you hire a really good owner's rep, and you hire a really good general contractor. Number one, it's almost impossible. We talk a lot about quantifications. We want to get as close as possible, but it's absolutely impossible to project what's actually behind the contract or concrete. We have ground penetrating radar, we have thermal imaging, we have all these tools, but at the end of the day, we can't see. We can't see how much your rebar is bad. And we try to cover our bases and say, based on historical data, and in other jobs similar to this is what we found. But you're going to have change orders. And you're going to find stuff, you're going to add stuff, you're going to get into something, and it's going to lead down another path. I'll give you an example. We were doing garage overhead concrete repairs, and there's all kinds of spalling concrete, and the engineer created a scope of work, looked good to me. We started repairs, started chipping away all the concrete, and guess what? There was conduit, electrical conduit, weaved in and out of all the rebar. And actually had live wires in it. So, change order, we could never projected that. We never knew it was there. It was an old building. They couldn't find the plans. There was all kinds of reasoning why, we shouldn't have known. We didn't know. And now we have a situation where there's change orders. So, it's a necessary evil. And I think, our plan previously we discussed is make sure that you have unit pricing in your contracts. Like, the cost for overhead concrete repairs full depth is whatever, $300 per cubic foot. Make sure that's in your contract besides your lump sums, because that's what you're going to rely on if there are change orders. And trust me, you will save a lot of money, because some contractors, there's a lot of good ones out there, will see the opportunity for change orders to change their price. So they change, maybe they charge, $300 a cubic foot for overhead repairs, full depth. And now, they submit a change order, doesn't have a lot of information, doesn't have like the unit cost. So maybe it's at 400, So that's another reason for the owner's rep. He can look at that sort of stuff and go, hey, wait, this doesn't make sense. Why did you charge us 300 in a contract and now it's 400 now? Oh, well, we got to amend the permit. We got to, a bit more administration. No. In your contract, it says here's your unit cost if we find extra work. So again, there's a way to control them. They're going to be there, but there's a way to control them. And this is one of the reasons that jobs get totally sideways and below the budget is because of change orders running rampant and nobody's paying attention, or they're not locked into some type of unit pricing. Do you want to say something, Maureen?
No, I think it's fabulous, the information that you're providing. It's just real best practice is to make sure the contracts are well defined, the scope of work, and again, you're protecting the association's asset at the end of the day. So you have to be very detail oriented and have the exposure and understanding, because it's an open checkbook if you think about it, and that it's not fair. That's not how you drive the business.
Yeah. And I've been in this industry for a long time, and a lot of this stuff I learned from experience, and a lot of it I've learned the hard way. Coming up, I made a lot of mistakes, and I always made sure I fixed them. But after 25 years, maybe more of being involved in these type of jobs, I've probably seen almost every type of scenario, and so that's what it's really satisfying to be able to, do these webinars and the Condo Connects and these sort of things nowadays, and help people.
Biz now, you're doing biz now in the future with Alex, our guy. Yes. We have 7 minutes left. Maria, I'm excited.
Okay, we're gonna speed through it. Subcontractor vetting, we already touched on that. Pre-planning, we touched on that, right? Scheduling, and performance advantage. Very quick. It's okay to ask to give the general contractor an incentive to finish early, right? Typically, we only ask for liquidated damages if they have a schedule overrun. It's whatever, $500 a day if they're not done by this date. Consider offering them incentives to finish the job early. We talked about the labor shortage, aging workforce, lack of vocational training. It's hard to find people in South Florida. And plus, there's nowhere for them to live. It's too expensive. We have a whole bunch of work. 558 claims, SB 4D, SB 154, HB 913, plus all the recertifications and the older buildings that have deferred maintenance. There's a lot of work, and there's very few qualified people and not enough labor. Talk about that. Tariffs and material costs. Look, we can't control tariffs. It is what it is, right? The best advice I can do is, again, pre-planning. You're going to need this much rebar. You're going to need this many windows. You're going to need this many doors. You're going to need this much waterproofing material. Get with your suppliers, order it, lock in the pricing. So in case it goes up, you're not affected. That's what we do. But usually we'll meet with our suppliers and we'll just say, hey, these are our next 5 jobs. This is what we're anticipating buying. We need you to lock in pricing. Everybody's been really super nice about doing that. We all have budget constraints, right? That's it. Again, pre-planning, get your team together. Permitting, permits take a long time. They're paying. It's just something we got to deal with. You can always get a permit expediter. They help. They're basically they spend all day at the permitting office, and takes the burden off you. I would recommend to get a permit expediter on every job. Otherwise, you're going to be the guy that's just standing around waiting to get your permits. Final tips: plan ahead, document everything. I tell my people, whether I'm owner's rep, consultant, or general contractor, pretend like this is going to go in front of a judge at some point. Document everything, pictures of everything. Save your emails, save everything. The owner's rep can help you with this. Typically we have, construction software that helps generate the reports. We have daily reports, we have pictures, we have everything. Make sure that's taking place, right? Ask to see if your board member can, ask to see it. Okay, what was going on this day? And if they can't show you what was going on that day, then you have a problem. know your contract terms and obligations. Contingency, probably one thing we should touch on for just a minute. I always tell people, look, there's unknowns, and we're talking about change orders, right? If there's unknowns, it's going to happen. Plan on, depending on the size of the job, I tell my board members and my managers anywhere from 10 to 20%. Usually I'm in the, historically, I'm in 12, 13% range on jobs that we produce, but you got to have a contingency. Like the bid that the GC gives you, it's probably going to be more than that. So prepare for at least 10% contingency.
And those soft costs really can also be escalated if you don't have a proper scope of work. So again, I think you're absolutely right. The market is between 10 to 12. You want to be very conservative. 20% is always good.
Yeah. So we've got time for a couple of questions, probably. We've got 3 minutes.
Well, we answered a lot we answered a few, like Maria mentioned, the webinar. Paul, you did fantastic.
I don't have any more questions here on the chat. I do have a request to see if we can, send them the PowerPoint presentation and of course the recording. So we will upload it on the YouTube channel and, we'll have it out to them with the presentation.
Look for Overton Construction and Consulting on YouTube. We have the certificate that will give the managers CU credits. We have a certificate of completion that can go to the board members. And we got Maureen's contact information. So anything we can do to help, let us know.
Absolutely. And AKAM also is we're going to also be putting the recording in our AKAM website as well. So again, in the perspective of management, here to help as an added resource. You could always email me. You'll have my contact information as well. So that's it.
All right. Well, everybody have a great rest of the day and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Paul.
Work.
Okay, everyone. Thanks.